The land did not care if a man lived or died. It was a vast, broken anatomy of red rock and gray sage, stretching out under a sky so blue it burned the eyes to look at it for too long. This was the Arizona Territory in the years following the Great War between the states, a place where the map was still being drawn in blood and gunpowder. Here, the stony mesas rose up like the ruined altars of forgotten gods, and the thorny brush clawed at the legs of anyone foolish enough to walk through it. The rivers were mostly dry skeletons of sand, waiting for the violent flash floods of July to give them a few hours of terrifying life. Dust storms were the only things that moved freely here. They swept down from the northern mountains, swallowing abandoned camps and lonely homesteads, scrubbing the wood of settler cabins until it turned the color of bone. It was a country of isolation, where a man could ride for 3 days and see nothing but buzzards circling a dead mule. Danger lived in the silence. It waited in the box canyons where renegade raiding parties hid their horses, and it rode with the weary cavalry patrols that crossed the same ground, looking for an enemy they could rarely find and could never truly defeat. Moving through this unforgiving immensity was a figure that seemed carved from the landscape itself. He was an Apache, but he was built on a scale that defied nature. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his shoulders a broad yoke of muscle that strained the seams of his buckskin shirt. His hair was black and coarse, hanging loose past his shoulders, and his face was a mask of hard angles and deep, copper-toned skin, pitted by the wind and the sun. His name was Taza, though few called him that anymore. To the nervous whispers of the white settlers, he was simply the giant. To the soldiers he had once guided, he was the big scout. To his own people, he was a ghost. Taza moved with a silence that belied his massive size. He placed his moccasined feet with care, avoiding loose shale and dry twigs, a habit drilled into him since boyhood and sharpened by years of war. He traveled alone, avoiding the smoke of white chimneys and the hide shelters of the Apache bands alike. He lived off the land, snaring rabbits and tracking mule deer, sleeping in the hollows of rocks or beneath the twisted arms of mesquite trees. He carried a Sharps rifle that looked like a toy in his enormous hands, and a knife with a blade as long as a man's forearm strapped to his thigh. But his heaviest burdens were not his weapons. They were the memories that walked beside him, louder than his own footsteps. He paused now on the rim of a limestone ridge, looking down into a shadowed valley. The wind whipped at his hair, bringing the scent of rain from 50 miles away. He closed his eyes and let the memory take him, the one that always came when the sun began to dip low. It was 2 years ago. He had ridden back to the camp of the Chiricahua, the band of his fathers, wearing the dusty blue coat of a U.S. Army scout. He had taken the coat not out of love for the white soldiers, but because the hunger in the winter camps had been killing the elders, and the army paid in beef and flour. He had thought his strength could serve his people by guiding the soldiers away from the women and children, by managing the inevitable collision of worlds. He had been wrong. He remembered dismounting before the wickiup of Nalin, the woman he had been promised to since they were children. She had been small, with eyes like dark water. He had brought her ribbons from the fort and a sack of coffee. Nalin had stepped out, but she did not smile. She did not look at the gifts. She looked at the blue wool on his shoulders, stained with sweat and dust. And then she looked at the ground. Standing behind her was distinct, a warrior named Chodi, a man of ordinary height but pure standing. Chodi had placed a hand on Nalin's shoulder, a claim of possession. Taza remembered the silence of the camp. The elders sat by the fire, smoking their pipes, refusing to meet his gaze. Finally, one old man, an uncle he had once carried on his back across a flooded river, had spoken. "The wolf does not live with the dogs," the uncle had said, his voice flat. "You have worn the blue skin. You have walked in the tracks of the enemy. You are strong. Taza, you are the mountain that walks, but you are unclean. The spirits do not know you anymore." Nalin had turned her back. That was the blade that cut deeper than any knife. She had chosen a man half his size, a man who had not compromised, even if that man could not protect her as Taza could. He had left the ribbons in the dirt and ridden away, tearing the blue coat from his body and leaving it rotting in a ravine, but the stain of it remained on his skin. He opened his eyes on the ridge, the old shame burning in his gut. He was too white for the Apache, and too Apache for the whites. The memory shifted, treacherous and quick, to a trading post near the Mexican border only 6 months ago. He had needed powder and salt. He had walked into the dim interior of the store, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The air smelled of tobacco and pickled eggs. The silence that fell over the room had been absolute. 2 women in calico dresses had gasped, grabbing their children and pulling them behind the terrifying barrier of their skirts. A little girl had begun to cry, a high, thin sound. Men leaning against the counter, cowboys with dust on their hats, had stiffened, their hands drifting toward the pistol butts at their hips. Taza had moved slowly, showing his empty hands. He approached the counter where the trader, a balding man with a nervous sweat on his upper lip, stood frozen. "Powder," Taza had said. His voice was a deep rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. He spoke English, a skill he had learned from the soldiers, but he used it sparingly. "And salt." He had placed $3 silver on the counter. Good money. Hard money. The trader had stared at the coins, then at Taza, and then he had reached under the counter and pulled out a double-barreled shotgun, leveling it at Taza's chest. "We don't serve your kind," the trader had stammered, his finger trembling on the trigger. "Not here. Get out, you animal!" "Animal," a cowboy had muttered, emboldened by the shotgun. "Look at the size of it. Should be in a circus or a cage." Taza had looked at the silver on the wood. He could have reached across, snapped the shotgun in half, and broken the trader's neck before the man could draw a breath. The rage had coiled inside him, hot and black, but he had seen the terror in the crying child's eyes. He saw the monster they saw, so he had turned, leaving the silver where it lay, and walked out into the blinding sunlight. The door slamming behind him like a judgment. He was a man of 2 worlds, and welcome in neither. 10 miles to the south, in the rough mining town of Granite Wells. The sun was just as hot, but the air was thick with the smell of sulfur, unwashed bodies, and despair. Granite Wells was a scab on the side of a canyon, a collection of hasty wooden buildings that leaned against each other for support. It was a place where men came to dig silver out of the earth and drink their wages away in the dark saloons that lined the single muddy street. At the far edge of town, where the respectable businesses gave way to the dumping grounds, stood a 2-story building that had once been painted white but was now the color of dust. A hand-painted sign swung above the porch, creaking in the wind. Vance's rooming house. Clara Vance was on her knees on the front porch, scrubbing a stubborn stain of tobacco juice from the warped pine boards. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years, though the harsh western sun and the relentless labor had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth, making her appear older. She was not a beauty in the way the saloon girls were, painted and bright. She was handsome in a sturdy, enduring way, with hair the color of dried wheat pulled back severely into a bun, and eyes that were a startling, clear gray. She dipped her brush into the bucket of lye water, her hands red and chapped. Her knuckles were swollen. She worked with a ferocity that suggested she was trying to scrub away more than just dirt. "Afternoon, Mrs. Vance," a voice drawled from the street. Clara didn't look up. She knew the voice. It was lush and heavy, belonging to Silas Thorne, the town banker's son, a man who thought his father's money bought him the right to stare. "Mr. Thorne," she said, keeping her eyes on the wood. "Awful hot for scrubbing," he said, leaning against the railing. His eyes traveled over the curve of her back, the stray wisp of hair escaping her bonnet. "You ought to hire a Chinaman for that. Or maybe you need a man around the house to handle the rough work." "I manage just fine," Clara said, her voice tight. "The inn is full. Mr. Thorne, I have no rooms if that is what you are asking." He chuckled, a low, wet sound. "Oh, I ain't looking for a room to sleep in. Clara, you know that. Everybody knows you run a welcoming establishment." Clara stopped scrubbing. She gripped the brush until her fingers turned white. She looked up, meeting his gaze with a cold, flat stare. "This is a respectable boarding house. I serve meals and I wash linens. If you want something else, go down to the Nugget Saloon. Now step off my porch before I pour this lye water over your boots." Thorne's smile vanished. He sneered, pushing himself off the rail. "Don't get high and mighty with me, Clara. We all know who pays for this place. We all know what you are." He turned and walked away, kicking up dust. Clara watched him go, her chest heaving. She didn't cry. She had forgotten how to cry 5 years ago. Instead, she dipped the brush back into the water and scrubbed harder, until the wood fibers began to fray. The town of Granite Wells tolerated her, but they did not accept her. To the church ladies who walked on the other side of the street, lifting the hems of their dresses as they passed her in, she was a stain on the community. To the children, she was the witch woman who lived alone. To the men, she was fair game, a woman without a protector, and therefore a woman who must be desperate for any scrap of attention. They were wrong. Clara Vance was not desperate. She was fortified. Her history was written in the scars she kept hidden beneath her high-collared dresses. She had come west 6 years ago as a bride, married to a man named Silas, not the banker's son, but a man named Silas Reed. He had been a miner, charming and loud, with big dreams of striking a vein of pure silver. But the silver never came. Only the whiskey did. Silas Reed had been a man who turned mean when the drink took him. He had gambled away her dowry in a single night. He had beaten her when the stew was cold, when the fire smoked, or when he simply hated his own reflection. Clara remembered the night the reputation was born. Silas had brought 3 men home from the saloon, drunk and laughing. He had told them, right in front of her, that since he couldn't pay his debts with gold, they could take it out in trade with his wife. She had fought. She had broken a bottle over one man's head and threatened Silas with a carving knife. The men had laughed and left, calling Silas a fool, but the damage was done. Silas had stormed out in a rage and died 3 days later in a shaft collapse. Crushed by the very rock he tried to rob, he left her with nothing but a half-built house and a name that was dragged through the mud. The town whispered that she had gone through with it, that she had entertained the men to pay the debts. They said she was a miner's widow, in the worst sense. Clara had never corrected them. She found that a ruined reputation had a strange sort of power. It kept the overly righteous away. It allowed her to operate her business with a steely independence. She took in laundry. She cooked meals for the transient miners who didn't care about gossip as long as the biscuits were hot. She saved every penny, hiding coins in a coffee tin beneath the floorboards, repairing the roof herself, glazing her own windows. She was proud. It was a lonely, bitter pride, but it held her upright. Later that afternoon, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters of the inn. Clara was in the kitchen, chopping onions for the evening stew. The air was thick with the smell of beef suet and boiling beans. 2 cowboys were sitting at the small table in the corner, nursing cups of bitter coffee. They were drifting hands, passing through from a drive in Texas, dusty and tired. "I tell you, I saw him," the younger one said, his voice hushed. "Big as a house. He was watching the herd from the ridge." "Apache?" the older one asked, blowing on his coffee. "Must be, but he didn't attack. That's the queer thing. We had a wheel bust on the chuck wagon near Darker Canyon. We was stuck. If a war party had come down, we'd have been scalped for sure. But this giant, he just sat up there on his horse, and when a pack of coyotes started spooking the calves, he put a bullet in the leader from 500 yards. Clean shot. Maybe he was scouting you for later." The older man grunted. "I don't think so," the young one insisted. "I heard stories in Tucson. They say there's a giant Apache who walks alone. They say he dragged a settler's wagon out of a flash flood last month near the Verde. Didn't ask for nothing, just pulled him out and vanished. Sounds like a tall tale. Kid, Apaches don't help white folks. They burn 'em. Clara paused, the knife hovering over an onion. She had heard these whispers before. The drifters brought news like pollen on the wind. A giant, a monster who didn't kill, a savage who acted with a strange, silent honor. She felt a peculiar tug in her chest. She wondered what it must be like to be so feared, to have people invent stories about you just to make sense of your existence. She wondered why a man whom the world hated would lift a finger to save it. It sounded like a fool's errand. It sounded like something she would understand. "More coffee?" she asked, her voice cutting through their conversation. The men jumped slightly. "Yes, ma'am," the older one said, looking at the table. They were polite enough, but they never looked her in the eye. They knew who she was supposed to be. By evening, the town of Granite Wells began to settle into its nightly rhythm of piano music and shouting from the saloons. The sun was sinking behind the red cliffs to the west, setting the sky on fire with streaks of violet and bruised orange. Clara finished wiping down the tables and walked to the back door of the inn to throw out the vegetable scraps. She paused there, wiping her hands on her apron. The back of the inn faced the open desert. The town ended abruptly at her property line, giving way to the vast, empty scrubland. The air was cooling rapidly. She took a deep breath, savoring the moment of quiet before the evening rush of hungry boarders. Then she saw him. He was far out, perhaps 300 yards away, standing on a rise of ground that overlooked the town. The distance was great, but even from here, his size was unmistakable. He was a silhouette against the dying light, a black cutout of a man that seemed too large for the horizon. He was motionless. He was facing the town, facing her in. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She should be afraid. She should run inside and bolt the door. She should call for the sheriff, an Apache warrior, alone at twilight, watching her house. But she didn't move. She stood frozen in the doorway, the bowl of scraps heavy in her hands. Up on the rise, Taza watched the lights of the town flicker to life. He smelled the wood smoke. He smelled the faint, savory aroma of beef stew drifting on the wind. His stomach tightened with hunger. He had not eaten in 2 days, save for a handful of dried berries. His eyes locked on the single figure standing in the doorway of the wooden building at the edge of town. He could not see her face, only the pale shape of her apron and the weary slump of her shoulders. He felt a pull so strong it almost made him take a step forward. It was not just the food. It was the devastating normality of it. A home, a woman in a doorway. A life that did not involve sleeping with a knife in his hand. He wanted, with a sudden, crushing desperation, to walk down that slope, to knock on the door, to ask, in his low, rumbling English, for a plate of food and a corner to sleep in where the wind didn't bite. But he knew what would happen. The screams, the guns, the hatred. He looked at the woman one last time. She seemed small, fragile, standing against the vast darkness gathering behind her. She was watching him. He knew. She was not running. "Go inside," he whispered to the wind, the words lost in the distance. "Go inside before the wolves come." He forced himself to turn away. It took every ounce of his will to break the connection. He turned his broad back to the inviting light of the inn, to the woman, to the promise of warmth. He adjusted the rifle on his shoulder and began to walk into the deepening shadow of the canyon, disappearing into the night that was his only true companion. Clara watched him vanish. She stood there for a long time, until the cold seeped into her bones. She didn't know why, but she felt a sudden, sharp sense of loss, as if she had just watched a part of herself walk away into the dark. She stepped back inside and locked the door. The morning broke not with light, but with a suffocating blanket of grit. Granite Wells had been overrun, not by an army, but by the chaotic commerce of a cattle drive moving north from the borderlands, colliding with a fresh influx of prospectors chasing rumors of a silver strike in the superstitions. The town was swollen, bursting at its rough-hewn seams. Men slept in the livery stables, in the haylofts, and curled like stray dogs under the boardwalks. The air was thick enough to chew, tasting of turned earth, manure, and the acrid smoke of cheap tobacco. It was a day when tempers were short and fuses were damp with sweat. Inside Vance's rooming house, Clara Vance moved like a woman wading through deep water. The hallway was lined with bedrolls. Men snored in her parlor, their boots sticking out into the walking path, muddy and scarred. She stepped over a sleeping cowboy who smelled of sage and old whiskey, balancing a tray of biscuits and coffee in her red, chapped hands. "Mind your feet," she said, her voice raspy from the dry air. The cowboy grunted and rolled over, muttering something unintelligible. Clara didn't stop. She had been up since 4 in the morning, kneading dough and boiling coffee that looked like crude oil. The inn was making money, more money in 3 days than she usually made in a month. But the cost was a tension that vibrated in the walls. These men were strangers, transients with no loyalty to the town and certainly no respect for a woman living alone. They paid their coins, but their eyes followed her with a mixture of speculation and hunger that made her skin crawl beneath her high-collared dress. Outside, the street was a river of noise. Drovers shouted at wayward steers. Wagons creaked and groaned under heavy loads. And the piano in the Nugget Saloon was already clanking out a tinny, desperate tune. On the southern edge of this chaos, a small caravan arrived. It was a group of traders, a mix of Mexican and Apache blood, men who lived in the gray spaces between nations. They led pack mules laden with cured hides and rough-broke horses. Walking at the rear of this group, keeping to the shadows of the mesquite brush, was Taza. He did not want to be here. The town smelled of confinement. It smelled of the anger of white men, but Miguel, the leader of the traders, had insisted. They were carrying silver, and the roads were thick with bandits. They needed the giant's eyes and his terrifying presence to ensure the trade went smoothly. "Stay by the horses," Miguel had told him in Spanish, handing him a strip of dried meat. "Watch the horizon. Do not go into the street unless the world ends." Taza had nodded. He stood near the corral at the edge of town, leaning against a fence post that creaked under his weight. He pulled his hat low, shadowing his face. Even so, he drew stares. A passing group of miners stopped, pointing and whispering, their hands hovering near their belts. Taza ignored them. He was a stone. He was a tree. He was not there. But the sky had other plans. By mid-morning, the strange yellow light that had been hanging over the mountains suddenly turned a bruised purple. The wind died completely. A terrifying silence that made the horses flatten their ears. Then, the horizon simply disappeared. A wall of dust, 1,000 feet high and boiling like smoke, swept down from the north. It hit Granite Wells with the force of a physical blow. The sun vanished. Day turned to a choking, brown twilight. Sand blasted the paint-off buildings and stung exposed skin like buckshot. Men shouted, running for cover, diving into saloons and stores. The cattle in the street panicked, bellowing and stampeding blindly. "Taza!" Miguel's voice was thin in the roaring wind. The trader stumbled out of the gloom, wrapping a scarf around his face. "The animals are spooked. We must get inside. The horses will break their legs if we leave them in the open. But we cannot stay out here." They managed to drive the mules into a lean-to behind the blacksmith's. But there was no shelter for the men. The wind was driving the sand with enough force to scour the lungs. "Vances!" Miguel shouted, grabbing Taza's arm. "The woman. She is fair. She will let us in." Taza pulled back, shaking his massive head. "No, she is white." "She is a businesswoman!" Miguel yelled over the gale. "And she owes me for the firewood I brought last winter. Come, you will die out here, or a soldier will shoot you in the confusion." Taza resisted, his boots digging into the dirt, but the wind was relentless. It tore at his clothes and filled his eyes with grit. He allowed Miguel to pull him toward the dim yellow light of the rooming house. Clara was struggling to latch the front door against the wind when it burst open. Miguel stumbled in, followed by 2 other traders, and finally, blocking out the storm like a mountain moving indoors, Taza entered. The door slammed shut. The sudden silence of the room was heavier than the noise outside. Every head in the parlor turned. The miners who had been playing cards froze. The cowboys eating at the long table stopped chewing. Taza stood near the door, water dripping from his hat, though it had not rained. Just the sweat of the storm. He filled the space. The ceiling seemed suddenly lower. He kept his head down, his shoulders hunched slightly as if trying to shrink inside himself. But there was no hiding a man of his size. "Miguel," Clara said, her chest heaving from the exertion of the door. She looked at the traders, then her eyes traveled up and up, to the giant behind them. She recognized him, the silhouette from the ridge, the ghost who had watched her. "Senora Vance," Miguel said, unwinding his scarf. He looked nervous, his eyes darting to the hostile men in the room. "The storm. It is bad. We have nowhere. I can pay. Silver. We don't want no Injuns in here." A voice cut through the room. It was a miner, a man with a beard like steel wool and eyes hard with gin. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the floorboards. "Get that animal out." "He is with me," Miguel said, stepping in front of Taza, though he looked like a child protecting a bear. "He guards my wagons." "I don't care if he guards the gates of hell," the miner spat. "He's an Apache. They burn folks. They scalp women." He looked at Clara. "You ain't gonna let that thing stand in your parlor. Are you, Clara, with decent white folk?" Clara looked at the miner, then at Taza. The giant had not moved. He did not look at the miner. He looked at the floor, his face impassive, but his hands were clenched at his sides. He was waiting for the rejection. He expected it. It was the only language the world spoke to him. Clara felt a flare of anger. It was not purely for the injustice, but for the assumption that these men could tell her who stood under her roof. This was her house, her sanctuary. "This is a place of business. Mr. Henderson," Clara said, her voice cutting through the tension. "And outside is a storm that would skin a man alive. I will not turn a dog out into that, let alone a man." "He ain't a man," Henderson growled, his hand dropping to the Colt Navy tucked in his belt. "He's a savage. He is a paying guest." Clara lied smoothly. She looked at Miguel. "I have no beds. You know that. The halls are full." "The floor is fine," Miguel said quickly. "Any corner." Clara hesitated. She could feel the violence coiling in the room. If she pushed too hard, Henderson and his friends would draw. If she sent Taza out, he might freeze or be shot by the nervous perimeter guards. "The kitchen," she said firmly. "He can sleep on a pallet in the kitchen. Out of the way. You boys take the corner by the stairs." Henderson looked like he wanted to argue, but another miner pulled his sleeve. "Let it be. Jack, look at the size of him. You want to start a war in a storm?" Henderson spat on the floorboards, missing Taza's boot by an inch. "I catch him near my gear. I'll put a hole in him big enough to see daylight through." Taza did not flinch. He did not speak. He waited for Clara's signal. "This way," she said, gesturing toward the back of the house. He followed her. As he passed the table, men pulled their plates away, as if his shadow might taint their food. Taza moved with that strange, quiet grace she had sensed before, making no sound despite his bulk. In the kitchen, the air was warm and smelled of yeast and stew. It was a small space, cluttered with sacks of flour and drying herbs. Clara pointed to a pile of burlap sacks in the corner near the stove. "It is not much," she said, "but it is warm." Taza looked at the corner, then at her. For the first time, he raised his eyes. They were dark, endless, and filled with a profound, weary shock. He had expected the gun. He had expected the door. "It is good," he said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. "Thank you," Clara nodded, feeling a sudden flush of heat in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the stove. She turned back to the pot of stew bubbling on the iron range. "You're hungry?" It wasn't a question. She ladled a massive portion of beef and beans onto a tin plate and cut a thick slice of cornbread. She set it on the small work table. "Eat." Taza stood still. He looked through the open doorway into the parlor, where the other men were now eating, tearing at their bread and slurping their coffee. "I will wait," he said softly. Clara paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "Wait for what?" "For them to finish," Taza said. "If I eat now, they will be angry. They will think I take their share. I will wait." Clara stared at him. Here was a man who could snap Mr. Henderson's spine with one hand, a man who terrified the entire territory, standing in her kitchen and refusing to eat until the white men were full, just to keep the peace for her sake. It was a humility that broke her heart. "You will eat now," Clara said, her voice fierce. "This is my kitchen. I decide who eats." She pushed the plate toward him. Taza looked at the food, the steam rising from the beef. He looked at Clara's hand resting on the table, small and scarred from work. He stepped forward slowly, like a wild animal approaching a trap that might also be a gift. He sat on a low stool that groaned under him. He took the spoon. He ate with a precision that surprised her. He did not shovel the food like the miners. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, wiping the plate clean with the bread. When he was finished, he stood up and carried the plate to the wash basin. "I will sleep now," he said. He moved to the corner, arranged the burlap sacks with a few efficient movements, and lay down. He turned his face to the wall, curling his massive frame into a ball, making himself as small as possible. Clara watched him for a long moment. She felt a strange urge to cover him with a blanket, as she would a child. But she quelled it. She went back to the parlor, her heart beating a strange, unsteady rhythm. Night fell, but the storm did not break. The wind howled around the eaves like a banshee, rattling the glass in the window frames. The inn settled into a tense, murmuring quiet, but the danger was far from over. In the Nugget Saloon down the street, the atmosphere was poisonous. The storm had trapped men with their liquor and their grievances. Among them was Captain Hatcher. Hatcher was a man who had left the army but never left the war. He wore a faded cavalry coat with the insignia ripped off, and he carried a bitterness that had turned his soul to vinegar. He had served in the Apache campaigns, tracking Taza's people through the Dragoon Mountains. He knew Taza. He remembered the scout. "I tell you, it's him," Hatcher shouted, slamming his glass onto the bar. "The big scout, the traitor. I saw him walk into Vance's place. He's just an Injun." "Hatcher," the bartender said nervously. "Leave it be. He ain't just an Injun," Hatcher snarled. "He's a killer. He led us into an ambush in '74. Watched 3 of my boys die with arrows in their guts and didn't lift a damn finger. And now he's sleeping on clean sheets?" Hatcher turned to the room, his eyes wild. "And that woman, that Vance woman, we always knew she was loose. We knew she had no morals, but bedding down with an Apache, bringing a savage into a white town." The crowd rumbled. The miners, drunk and bored, latched onto the anger. It was something to do. It was a target for their frustration with the storm, the mines, and their own empty lives. "She's shaming us," a voice cried out. "She's shaming every white woman in the territory. We ought to teach them a lesson," Hatcher said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "We ought to go over there and drag that buck out, hang him high. And as for her, maybe we remind her who she belongs to. Remind her she can't just open her legs for anything that walks out of the desert." A cheer went up, ugly, sharp. Inside the inn, Clara heard them coming before she saw them. The wind carried the sound of their shouting, a discordant roar that rose above the gale. She was in the kitchen, banking the fire in the stove. Taza was asleep, or seemed to be, his breathing slow and deep. The front door of the inn shook under a heavy blow. "Open up, Clara!" Hatcher's voice boomed. "We know you got him in there." Clara froze. The blood drained from her face. She knew that tone. She had heard it in her husband's voice before the first blow landed. It was the sound of men who had given themselves permission to be monsters. "Open up, or we break it down." The guests in the parlor were waking up, scrambling out of their bedrolls, confused and frightened. "What's going on?" someone shouted. "They want the Indian," another answered. "Best let them have him. Mrs. Don't want no trouble." Clara looked at the front door, the wood bowing under the assault. Then she looked at Taza. He was awake. He had risen silently, the long knife already in his hand. He stood in the shadows of the kitchen, his body tense, a coil of explosive energy. He looked at her, and his eyes were flat and dead. He knew this ending. He would kill 3 or 4 of them, and then they would riddle him with bullets. He was ready to die. But as Clara looked at him, she saw something else. She saw the man who had waited to eat. She saw the man who had tried to walk away on the ridge to spare her this very moment. She felt a hot, blinding rebellion rise in her throat. She had spent 5 years being the victim. She had spent 5 years letting the town define her, shame her, and push her into the dirt. She would not let them murder a guest in her kitchen. She would not let them drag her out and use her as a lesson. "No," she whispered. She moved. She didn't go to the front door. She went to Taza. "Put the knife away," she hissed. Taza looked down at her, confused. "They come to kill. Put it away." She grabbed his wrist. His skin was hot and rough. She pulled him back down onto the pallet. He resisted for a fraction of a second, his strength immovable. But the look in her eyes, wild, desperate, and commanding, made him yield. He sank back onto the burlap. "Lie down," she ordered. She dropped to her knees and lay down beside him. The pallet was narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders. She pressed herself against him, her back to the room, her front against his side. She could feel the erratic thudding of his heart, the immense heat radiating from him. She grabbed his arm, heavy as a tree limb, and pulled it over her waist. "What are you—" Taza began, his voice a vibration against her cheek. "Be quiet," she breathed. "Play along. If you want to live, play along." The front door splintered open. Wind and sand exploded into the hallway, followed by Hatcher and 6 other men. They carried lanterns and pistols. Their faces were twisted with the anticipation of violence. "Where is he?" Hatcher screamed, storming into the parlor. He kicked a sleeping miner out of the way. "Where is the savage?" The room was silent. The guests pointed toward the kitchen. Hatcher marched to the doorway, raising his lantern. The light swung into the small room, cutting through the shadows. "There you are, you son of a—" Hatcher stopped. The men behind him piled up, peering over his shoulders. The air went out of the room. They saw the pallet. They saw the giant Apache lying there. And they saw Clara Vance, the respectable innkeeper, curled against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand clutching his buckskin shirt. It was an image so intimate, so shockingly domestic, that it short-circuited their rage. It was one thing to drag a hiding fugitive out of a pantry. It was another thing entirely to pull a man out of a woman's bed. Clara raised her head. She didn't look terrified. She looked annoyed. She smoothed her hair and glared at Hatcher with a gaze that could have frozen whiskey. "Is there a reason you are breaking down my door, Captain Hatcher?" she asked. Her voice shook, but she forced it to be loud, to carry to every ear in the house. "Or do you make a habit of watching married folks sleep?" "Married?" Hatcher spluttered, lowering his gun slightly. He's an Apache. Clara! He's a monster. He is my man," Clara said. The words tasted like copper in her mouth, terrifying and exhilarating. She pressed closer to Taza, feeling his muscles lock rigid as stone. "He paid for this room. He paid for his supper, and he is here by my invitation." She looked at the mob, meeting their eyes one by one. "You say I have no morals? Fine. Believe what you want, but this is my house, and this man is mine now. If you want to drag him out, you drag me out with him, and I will make sure the sheriff knows exactly who broke into a woman's bedroom in the middle of the night." She turned her face to Taza, her lips inches from his ear, her breath warm on his neck. "You're mine now," she whispered, low and fierce, for the room to hear. "Tell them—" Taza's mind was reeling. The scent of her, soap and sage and fear, filled his nose. The weight of her arm on him was heavier than any chain he had ever worn. She was lying. She was insane. She was saving his life. He understood the game. He rose slowly on one elbow, the movement shifting Clara slightly. He did not let go of her. He kept her close, a protective, possessive gesture. He turned his face to Hatcher. He did not look like a victim. He looked like a king interrupted on his throne. His eyes were black voids, reflecting the lantern light with a cold, predatory gleam. He let his lip curl slightly, revealing white teeth. It was a look of pure, concentrated menace. It said, "Step forward and die." "Get out!" Taza rumbled. The sound was deep, vibrating in the chests of the men in the doorway. Hatcher took a step back. He looked at the gun in his hand, then at the massive warrior who seemed to fill the room, and the woman who clung to him like a lioness. The narrative had broken. This wasn't a lynching anymore. It was a domestic dispute with a giant. The miners behind Hatcher shuffled their feet. Their bloodlust was cooling, replaced by a sudden, awkward shame. Breaking up a romance, no matter how unnatural they thought it, felt wrong in a way that hanging a stranger didn't. "She's crazy," one of the men muttered. "Let's go, Hatcher. This ain't right." Hatcher glared at Taza, hate burning in his eyes. But he saw the size of the arms wrapped around the woman. He saw the knife lying within Taza's reach, and he saw the way Clara looked at him, with a defiance that terrified him. "You'll regret this, Clara," Hatcher spat. "You've marked yourself for good now. Don't expect a decent soul to talk to you ever again." "I never found much use for your kind of decency, Captain," Clara shot back. "Close the door on your way out." Hatcher swore, holstered his pistol, and turned on his heel. The mob dissolved, muttering and cursing, flowing back out into the hallway and out into the storm. The front door slammed shut, cutting off the wind. Silence rushed back into the kitchen. It was a thick, ringing silence. Clara did not move. She couldn't. Her limbs had turned to water. She lay there, pressed against the buckskin and the hard muscle of the Apache giant, listening to the fading footsteps. Taza did not move either. He lay rigid, staring at the door. He could feel the rapid flutter of her heart against his ribs. He could feel the warmth of her legs against his. Something had snapped in the world. A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. She had claimed him. She had spoken words of possession over him, words that had been denied to him by his own people. Even if it was a lie, the echo of it hung in the air, heavy and binding. Clara slowly withdrew her arm. She sat up, pulling her knees to her chest, trembling violently now that the danger was past. She didn't look at him. She stared at the stove. Taza sat up as well. He looked at her back. He wanted to speak, to ask why, to tell her she was a fool, to thank her, but the words were stuck in his throat. They sat there in the dark kitchen, side by side, the distance between them gone, bound together by a lie that felt dangerously, terrifyingly real. Dawn broke over granite wells with the color of a fresh bruise, a pale, sickly violet bleeding into gray. The storm had passed, leaving the town scrubbed raw and buried under inches of drift sand. Inside the kitchen of Vance's rooming house, the air was cold and still, heavy with the scent of stale fear and the lingering warmth of two bodies that had been pressed together for hours. Clara Vance woke first. She was stiff, her neck cricked at an awkward angle against the rough wool of the blanket. For a moment, suspended in the haze of sleep, she did not remember why the world felt so solid and warm beneath her cheek. She shifted, and the mattress breathed. Memory returned with the force of a physical blow. The shouting men, the gun barrels, the lie she had shouted into the face of the mob. "You are mine now." She pulled away as if burned, scrambling to her feet, her boots skidding on the sandy floorboards. She smoothed her wrinkled dress with shaking hands, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She refused to look at the pallet in the corner. She could not bear to see if he was awake, if he was looking at her, if he remembered the way her arm had draped over his chest as if she had the right to hold him. In the corner, Taza did not move. He had been awake for an hour, listening to the wind die down, listening to the woman's breathing change from the ragged rhythm of terror to the slow, deep cadence of sleep. When she pulled away, he felt the loss of her warmth like a sudden draft, a chill that went deeper than his skin. He sat up slowly, his movements controlled and silent. The floorboards did not creak. He folded the blanket with precise, military corners, a habit learned from the cavalry and never unlearned. He kept his eyes on his hands, large and copper-skinned against the gray wool. He could feel her standing by the stove, vibrating with a nervous energy that filled the small room. "Coffee," Clara said. Her voice was brittle, cracking on the first syllable. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder. "I need to make coffee. The guests will be waking soon." "Yes," Taza said. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of stones shifting in a riverbed. He stood, and the kitchen suddenly felt too small. He towered over the stove, over the table, over her. Clara busied herself with the grinder, the mechanical screech of metal on beans filling the silence. A welcome distraction. She kept her back to him. "You should go," she said, not turning around. "The storm is over. Your friends, the traders, they will be leaving." "Miguel waits for the mud to dry," Taza said. "He will not leave until noon." "Then you should go to him," Clara said, her knuckles white on the grinder handle. "Last night, it was necessary, but it is day now. People will talk. They will say terrible things. They already say them," Taza replied gently. Clara stopped grinding. She stood motionless. He was right. The damage was done. She had saved his life, and perhaps her own. But she had paid for it with the last shred of her reputation. She turned to face him then. He was looking at her, his dark eyes unreadable but not unkind. He did not look at her with the lust of the men in the saloon, nor the contempt of the town wives. He looked at her with a strange, grave curiosity. "I stained you," Taza said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, heavy with regret. "To lie with an Apache, even in a lie, it marks you." "I was already marked," Clara said, lifting her chin with that stubborn pride he had seen the day before. "One more scar won't kill me, but you staying here might kill you. Hatcher won't forget." "Hatcher is a coward," Taza said. "Cowards bite only when the wolf is away. If I stay, he will not bite." Clara stared at him. "Stay? Here? I have no money for a room," Taza said. "But I can work. I can chop wood. I can fix the door they broke. Until Miguel leaves." Clara looked at the broken latch on the kitchen door, the splintered wood hanging by a hinge. She looked at the heavy sacks of flour she struggled to move every week. And she looked at Taza, this mountain of a man who had let her use him as a shield, who had played the part of her husband to save her from a mob. "I can't pay you," she said softly. "You gave me food." Taza said, "You gave me a place to sleep. That is pay." Clara nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. "Fine, but you stay out of the main parlor when the guests are eating. I won't have fights over breakfast. I will be a shadow," Taza promised. By mid-morning, the sun was blazing with an indifferent brilliance, baking the mud in the streets into hard, cracked clay. The town of Granite Wells had woken up with a hangover and a new scandal to chew on. The story of the previous night had spread with the speed of a prairie fire. The scene in the kitchen had been retold and embellished until it became a grotesque legend. They said Clara Vance had been bewitched. They said the Apache giant had used dark medicine to cloud her mind. Others, the more vicious ones, laughed and said it was no magic at all, just the natural desperation of a woman who had fallen so low she would take a savage into her bed because no white man would keep her. When Clara walked to the general store to buy sugar, the reaction was immediate. Mrs. Higgins, the banker's wife, was coming out of the door. She saw Clara and physically recoiled, gathering her skirts and stepping into the mud of the street to avoid passing her on the boardwalk. She didn't just look away. She stared with a mixture of horror and fascination, as if Clara had grown a second head. "Shameless, Mrs." Higgins whispered loudly to her companion. "Absolutely shameless, to think we let her live among decent Christian folk." Clara kept her head high, her face a mask of stone. She walked into the store. The clerk, a young man named Timothy, who usually smiled at her, turned his back and busied himself arranging tins of peaches. 3 pounds of sugar, Timothy," Clara said to his back. He turned slowly. He didn't smile. He threw a sack on the counter with a heavy thud. "That'll be 4 bits." "It was 3 bits yesterday," Clara said. "Price went up," Timothy said, his eyes sliding away from hers. "Shortage, due to the storm." It was a lie. Clara knew it. She placed the coins on the counter, 4 bits, and took the sugar. She walked out, feeling the eyes of the men on the porch drilling into her back. "Hey, Clara," one of them called out. It was a drunk miner, leaning against a post. "Does he speak English? Or do you just grunt at each other in the dark?" Laughter rippled down the porch. Clara did not stop. She did not flinch. She walked straight back to her inn, her spine rigid, her heart boiling with a corrosive mixture of shame and fury. They hated her. They had always hated her. But now they felt justified in their hate. She had confirmed every whisper, every rumor. When she entered the backyard of the inn, she stopped. Taza was there. He had found a sledgehammer and was fixing the fence that the storm had knocked down. He held a fence post that would have taken 2 men to lift, driving it into the earth with a single, fluid motion of his shoulders. He was stripped to his waist, his skin gleaming with sweat, mapped with the white lines of old scars. He paused when he saw her. He saw the tightness around her mouth, the sheen of unshed tears in her gray eyes. He knew. He didn't say anything. He simply nodded to her, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and went back to work. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the hammer against the wood felt like a heartbeat, steady and reassuring. Clara went inside and leaned against the closed door. Closing her eyes, the inn felt different. Usually, the emptiness of the house during the day was a hollow, lonely thing. Now, she could hear the work going on outside. She could feel the presence of him. It wasn't just that he was big. It was that he was there, for the first time in 5 years. She wasn't the only one holding the walls up. Over the next 3 days, a strange, silent routine formed between them. Miguel and the traders had been delayed further by a lame horse, giving Taza an excuse to remain. He worked from dawn until dusk. He fixed the kitchen door so that it was stronger than it had been when the house was new. He chopped a mountain of firewood, stacking it with geometric precision. He carried the heavy barrels of water from the pump without spilling a drop, a task that usually left Clara's back aching for hours. And at night, he stood in the yard. He didn't make a show of it. He simply leaned against the corner of the porch, wrapped in his blanket, smoking a small pipe. He was a statue in the darkness. The effect on the clientele was miraculous. The rowdy miners who usually banged on the tables and grabbed at Clara's apron strings became quiet and polite. They had seen the giant. They knew he was watching. The Nugget Saloon might be full of bluster, but no man wanted to be the one to test the Apache warrior alone in the dark. Clara found herself sleeping deeply for the first time in years. The constant, low-level hum of fear, the fear of drunk men, of break-ins, of violence, had been silenced by the shadow in the yard. But with the safety came a confusion that she couldn't scrub away. She found herself watching him. She watched his hands, so large and scarred, yet so careful when he mended a broken chair leg. She watched the way he moved, with a predator's grace that made the wooden floorboards seem to respect him. On the 3rd evening, the kitchen was quiet. The guests had eaten and retired to the parlor or the saloons. Clara was drying dishes. Taza sat at the small table, mending a tear in his moccasin with a bone needle. "The town," Clara said, breaking the silence. "They say you are a monster, a killer." Taza didn't look up from his sewing. "I have killed. Does that make me a monster?" "Depends on why you killed," Clara said. Taza pulled the thread tight. "I killed for my people, to keep the soldiers from the winter camps. Then I killed for the soldiers, to keep my people from the reservations. I killed to live. In the end, I killed for nothing. Both sides call me enemy." He looked up then. The lamplight cast deep shadows in the hollows of his face. "And you?" he asked. "They say you are a bad woman, that you have no honor." Clara wiped a plate aggressively, almost chipping the rim. "My husband, Silas, He was a bad man. He liked to use his fists. He liked to gamble. He told people lies about me to cover his own debts. When he died, the lies stayed." She paused, her hand trembling. She had never told this to anyone. Not the whole truth. "I lost a baby," she whispered. 3 months along. Silas came home drunk. He threw me against the stove. She touched her side, an unconscious gesture to an old pain. After that, I decided I would never belong to a man again. I would be my own master. If they want to call me a whore because I survive without a husband, let them." Taza looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine, but he also saw the cracks in the iron. He saw a warrior who had fought a war alone, without weapons, surrounded by enemies. "You are strong," Taza said. "Stronger than Nalin." "Nalin? The woman I was to marry," Taza said. He looked at the window, at the darkness pressing against the glass. She saw my scars. She saw the blue coat of the army. She saw shame. She chose a man who was pure, a man who had never walked in the white man's world. She wanted safety. "There is no safety," Clara said bitterly. "Not for people like us." "No," Taza agreed. "There is only enduring." He stood up to put the needle away. In the small kitchen, he had to squeeze past her to reach the shelf. The space was too narrow. As he passed, his arm brushed against hers. It was a light touch, barely a graze, but it sent a shock through Clara that made her gasp. It wasn't static electricity, it was heat. It was the sudden, overwhelming awareness of his body, the solid reality of him. They froze. Taza stopped, half turned toward her. He was so close she could smell the wood smoke in his hair and the scent of rain on his skin. She looked up, and he looked down. For a heartbeat, the air in the kitchen vanished. The gap between them, bridged by that accidental touch, felt charged with a terrifying potential. Clara felt a flush rise from her neck to her cheeks. She remembered the weight of him on the pallet. She remembered the sound of his heart. She realized, with a jolt of panic, that she wanted him to touch her again. She wanted him to wrap those massive arms around her and block out the world. She, who had sworn off men, who associated a man's touch with pain, was trembling with a sudden, sharp hunger. Taza saw it. He saw her pupils dilate. He heard the catch in her breath. He felt the same pull, a deep, tidal drag in his blood. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to smooth the worry from her forehead. But he stepped back. He was the monster. She was the white woman. To touch her in truth would be to sign her death warrant. "I will check the horses," he said, his voice rough. He turned and walked out the back door, disappearing into the night. Clara stood by the sink, gripping the edge of the basin, trying to remember how to breathe. The fourth night brought the wind again. It was late autumn, the season when the high desert turned violent. The gale came down from the peaks, screaming like a wounded thing. It battered the rooming house, rattling the shutters and making the timbers groan. Clara was asleep in a room on the second floor. It was a small room, sparse and clean, the only place that was truly hers. But tonight, it was not a sanctuary. She was dreaming. In the dream, the wind was the sound of Silas's voice, roaring at her. She was back in the cabin they had shared, the air smelling of whiskey and stale sweat. Silas was coming for her, his fist raised, his face twisted into a mask of pure hate. "You're nothing," he screamed. "You're mine to break." She tried to run, but the floor turned to mud. She tried to scream, but her mouth filled with dust. He was closer. Closer. The blow descending. Clara woke with a cry, sitting bolt upright in bed. The room was dark, lit only by the flashes of lightning that illuminated the cracks in the wall. The house was shaking in the wind. She was sweating, her nightgown clinging to her skin. Her heart racing so fast it hurt. She couldn't stay here. The room felt like a coffin. The memory of Silas was too real, summoned by the violence of the storm. She grabbed her shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders. She opened her door and stepped into the hallway. The inn was dark and full of the sounds of sleeping men, snores, coughs, the creak of bed springs. But she didn't feel safe among them. They were just men. They were the same kind of men as Silas. She went downstairs. Her feet knew the way in the dark. She moved through the parlor, stepping over the shadows of the furniture. Drawn by a need she didn't want to name, she pushed open the kitchen door. It was warmer here. The stove still held the heat of the day's cooking. In the corner, the dark shape of the giant was a mound on the floor. Taza was awake. He had heard her footsteps on the stairs. He had heard the difference in her gait, the lightness of her bare feet, the hesitation. He sat up as she entered. A flash of lightning lit the room, and he saw her. She looked small and pale, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes wide with the residue of the nightmare. She was shaking. "Clara?" he whispered. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The terror of the dream was still vibrating in her nerves. She walked toward him. She wasn't thinking about the town. She wasn't thinking about propriety. She was thinking that he was the only thing in the world that felt solid. He was the mountain that didn't move. She reached the pallet and stopped, looking down at him. She was shivering violently. Taza didn't ask what was wrong. He saw the fear. He knew the look of someone who'd been chased by ghosts. He lifted the edge of his blanket. It was a simple gesture, an invitation, a question. Clara dropped to her knees. She crawled under the rough wool. She lay down beside him, fully clothed in her nightgown and shawl, and curled into him. He lowered the blanket over them. This time, it was not a performance. There was no audience. There was no gun at the door. Clara pressed her face into the curve of his shoulder. He smelled of sage and skin. She wrapped her arm around his waist, holding on as if the wind might blow her away. Taza lay still, afraid to move, afraid to break the moment. He felt the dampness of her tears on his skin. He slowly, hesitantly, brought his arm around her. His hand covered her back, broad and warm. "The dream?" he asked softly. "He was here," Clara whispered, her voice muffled against him. "Silas, he was going to kill me." "He is dead," Taza said firmly. "He is dust. He cannot hurt you." "The memories hurt," she said. "They don't die." "No," Taza agreed. "They do not." He tightened his hold on her. "I see them too, the faces." "Who?" "The men I tracked," Taza said. His voice was a vibration against her chest. "There was a band in the Dragoons, my cousins. The army wanted them. I led the soldiers to the canyon. I thought if they surrendered, they would be fed. They would live." He paused, a shudder running through his massive frame. "The soldiers did not want surrender. They wanted blood. They killed them all. Women, children." "I stood there in my blue coat and watched the smoke rise. I hear their screams in the wind every night. I wash my hands, but the red does not come off." Clara pulled back slightly, just enough to look at his face in the dark. She traced the line of his jaw with her thumb. It was a bold, intimate touch. "You aren't a monster, Taza," she whispered. "You were a man trying to save what you could in a world that wanted to burn everything." "I failed," he said bleakly. "We all fail," Clara said. "I failed too. I wished him dead. Taza, every night when he hit me, I prayed to God to stop his heart. I prayed for the mine to fall on him, and then it did. I killed him with my heart before the rock ever touched him. I was glad he died. Does that make me a monster?" "No," Taza said. He turned his head, his face inches from hers. "It makes you a survivor." The air between them changed. The grief was still there, but beneath it, the fire had returned. The heat of their bodies, pressed together under the wool, was rising. Clara looked at his mouth. She saw the softness there, contradicting the hardness of his face. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart against her breast. "Taza," she breathed. She shifted, her legs sliding between his. The friction of the movement sent a jolt through both of them. Taza groaned, a low sound deep in his throat. He wanted her. The desire hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wanted to pull her beneath him, to bury himself in her warmth, to forget the blood and the dust and the shame. He wanted to claim her in truth. His hand slid down her back to her waist, pulling her flush against him. Clara gasped. her hands tangling in his long hair. She lifted her face, her lips parting. They froze, hovering on the precipice. Their breath mingled, their noses touched. It would be so easy. It would be an obliteration of the loneliness. But Taza stopped. He pulled back, just an inch. His breathing was ragged. "If we do this," he whispered, his voice strained, "there is no going back. The town, they will kill you for it, if they know it is true." "I don't care about the town," Clara said, though her voice trembled. "I do," Taza said. "I care that you live." He rested his forehead against hers. He did not let her go, but he did not take what she was offering. Not yet. It was too dangerous, too raw. They were two wounded animals seeking comfort, and he would not mistake her fear for love. He would not take advantage of her nightmare. "Sleep," he commanded softly. "I am here. I will not let the ghosts in." Clara let out a long, shuddering breath. She felt a pang of disappointment, sharp and hot. But beneath it, a profound relief. He had protected her honor, even from himself. She settled back against him, her head on his shoulder. Her hand rested over his heart. "You're mine," she whispered, echoing the lie that was becoming the truth. "I am yours," he answered in the dark. Outside, the storm raged on, battering the fragile walls of the inn. But inside, in the small, warm space under the blanket, there was a peace that neither of them had known in a lifetime. They slept, entangled, hearts dangling between the hope of a future and the terrified knowledge that the morning sun would bring the world back to their door. The peace that had settled over Vance's rooming house was as fragile as a sheet of ice on a desert trough, and it shattered 3 days later with the arrival of 5 riders from the south. They rode into Granite Wells in the middle of the afternoon, their horses frothed with sweat and dust coating their coats like gray paint. Leading them was a man who sat his saddle with the stiff, pained posture of someone who had spent a lifetime at war. He wore a heavy canvas duster, despite the heat, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over eyes that were the color of stagnant water. This was Captain Phineas Kincaid. He was not a stranger to the territory, and to Taza. He was a ghost summoned from the bloodiest chapters of the past. Kincaid and his men did not go to the livery. They tied their horses directly in front of the Nugget Saloon and walked in, their spurs singing a jagged metal song on the boardwalk. Within an hour, the mood in Granite Wells shifted. The uneasy tolerance that the town had shown Clara Vance and her Apache guest began to curdle into something sour and volatile. Kincaid brought news, and like most news in the borderlands, it was soaked in blood. He spoke of a raid on the Gila River, of a ranch burned to the ground and a family slaughtered. He spoke of cattle hamstrung and left to rot. And then, standing at the bar with a whiskey in his hand, he spoke of the man he blamed for it. "I know the sign," Kincaid told the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the rough rasp of command. "I tracked the Apache for 10 years. I know how they move. And I know who leads them when they want to be ghosts. You have a devil in your midst. Boys, a devil I thought was dead." He turned his pale eyes toward the window, looking down the street toward the rooming house. "They call him Taza," Kincaid said, spitting the name like a curse. "The army paid him to hunt his own kind. But a wolf don't turn into a dog just because you put a collar on him. He turned on us, led my patrol into a box canyon in '74, watched my men die while he sat on a rock and laughed, and now I hear he is sleeping in a white woman's bed, eating white man's bread." The rumors, which had been simmering, boiled over. Kincaid gave the town's prejudice a shape and a justification. He turned Taza from a curiosity into a threat, and Clara from a fallen woman into a traitor. The first stone hit the inn just after sunset. Clara was in the kitchen, wiping down the table, when the glass shattered in the front parlor. The sound was shocking, a violent intrusion into the quiet house. She ran into the hallway to find a jagged rock sitting on the rug, surrounded by glittering shards of window pane. Taza was there before her. He moved with terrifying speed for a man of his size. He stood in the shadows of the parlor, looking out the broken window. His face was a mask of stone, but his hands were clenched so tight the knuckles were white. "Get back," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Stay away from the glass." "Who is it?" Clara asked, clutching her apron, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Cowards," Taza said. "Men who throw rocks in the dark." The next morning, the insults were not just thrown, they were painted. When Clara went out to sweep the porch, she found the side of her inn defaced, crude. Dripping letters in red paint spelled out savage lover and traitor. Clara stared at the words. The sun beat down on her neck, hot and accusing. She felt a wave of nausea, not from fear, but from the sheer, grinding weight of the hatred. She walked to the shed, retrieved a bucket of lye water and a stiff brush, and began to scrub. Taza came out a moment later. He saw the words. He saw Clara scrubbing, her shoulders shaking with the effort, her hands raw from the lye. He stepped forward, reaching for the brush. "Clara, stop! I will do it!" "No!" Clara snapped, pulling away. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She scrubbed harder, the bristles tearing at the wood. "Go inside. Taza, please. If they see you, it only makes it worse." Taza stood frozen. He watched her fight the red paint, knowing that the stain was not on the wood, but on her life. And he had put it there. The guilt rose in him, black and choking. He had thought he could protect her by staying, by being the wall between her and the world. But he realized now that he was not the wall. He was the target, and she was standing in the line of fire. "I bring this?" he said softly. "They bring this," Clara hissed, dipping the brush again. "Small men with small minds." "Kincaid is not small," Taza said. "He is poison. He will not stop until there is blood." The escalation came 2 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat lay over the town like a heavy wool blanket. Clara needed flour. The inn was empty of guests. The fear of Kincaid and his men had driven away even the most desperate boarders. Her livelihood was drying up as surely as the creek beds in August. "I'm going to the store," Clara announced, tying her bonnet strings with trembling fingers. "I will come," Taza said from the kitchen doorway. "No," Clara said. "You stay here. Kincaid is at the saloon," Taza said. "His men watch the street. I will not let you walk alone." "If you come, there will be a fight," Clara argued, though her voice lacked conviction. She was terrified to walk that street alone, to feel the eyes of the town stripping her bare. "There is already a fight," Taza said. "We are just waiting for the bell." He picked up his hat and opened the door. They walked down the center of the street. It was a gauntlet. The town of Granite Wells seemed to hold its breath. Men stopped their work to watch. Women pulled their children inside. Taza walked half a step behind Clara, his massive shadow stretching over her, his eyes scanning the rooftops and alleyways. He carried no rifle, only the knife at his belt, but his presence was a weapon in itself. They reached the general store without incident, but the silence was heavy, charged with static. It was on the walk back that the trap sprang. Captain Kincaid stepped out of the Nugget Saloon. He was flanked by 4 men, hard cases with tied-down holsters and eyes that had seen too much cruelty. They blocked the boardwalk. Clara stopped. Taza moved instantly to her side, placing his body between her and the men. "Well now," Kincaid drawled, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet street. "If it ain't the happy couple, Beauty and the Beast, though I reckon in this light it's hard to tell which is which." "Step aside, Captain," Clara said, her voice shaking but loud. "We have business to attend to." "Your business is done in this town, Mrs. Vance," Kincaid said, stepping off the boardwalk into the dust of the street. He looked past her, fixing his gaze on Taza. "I'm talking to the dog. Do you remember me, Scout?" Taza looked at him. His face was impassive, archaic in its stillness. "I remember. Kincaid, I remember the village at Sibicu. I remember you gave the order to fire on the women while they gathered corn." The accusation hung in the air. Stark and brutal. Kincaid's face flushed a dark, angry red. "You shut your lying mouth. That was a war operation. But you led the raid on the McAllister place last week, didn't you? Tell these good people how you nailed John McAllister to his barn door. Tell them how you took his wife." "I was here," Taza said calmly. Mending a fence. Liar, Kincaid shouted. He was playing to the crowd now, the miners and shopkeepers gathering on the porches. Once a savage, always a savage. You got the bloodlust in you. It don't wash out. He took a step closer, his hand hovering near his pistol. And you, Kincaid sneered, turning his eyes back to Clara. He looked her up and down with a slow, degrading assessment. What kind of woman spreads her legs for a murderer? I guess the rumors were true about you all along. Clara, you ain't just a widow. You're a savage's whore, traitor to your race. You ought to be shaved bald and whipped out of town. He spat into the dirt, the saliva landing inches from Clara's hem. The stillness in Taza broke. It was not a gradual anger. It was an explosion. The giant moved so fast that the human eye struggled to track him. He covered the 10 feet between them in a single lunging stride. Kincaid's hand went for his gun, but he was too slow. Taza's fist, the size of a sledgehammer, connected with Kincaid's jaw. The sound was like a gunshot, the wet, sickening crack of bone hitting bone. Kincaid was lifted off his feet. He flew backward, crashing through the swinging doors of the saloon, taking splinters and glass with him. The 4 men with Kincaid shouted and reached for their weapons. Taza spun, his long knife flashing into his hand. He roared, a sound that was not human, a sound that came from the deepest canyons of the old world. He grabbed the first man by the lapels and threw him into a horse trough with enough force to shatter the wood. He backhanded the second man, sending him sprawling into the dust, unconscious before he hit the ground. It was a massacre of strength. Taza was a force of nature, a whirlwind of repressed rage and terrifying power. He did not draw blood with the knife. He used his hands, his elbows, his sheer mass. He stormed into the saloon after Kincaid. Kincaid was on the floor, groggy, blood pouring from his mouth. He fumbled for his dropped pistol. Taza kicked it away, sending it skittering across the floorboards. He reached down, grabbed Kincaid by the throat, and lifted him. Taza pinned the captain against the bar, his feet dangling 6 inches off the floor. Kincaid clawed at the massive hand crushing his windpipe, his face turning purple. Taza raised his other fist. He could kill him. 1 blow to the temple, 1 squeeze of the hand. It would be justice. It would be for Sibique. It would be for Clara. The red haze of battle descended on him, the old song of war pounding in his ears. Taza, no! The scream cut through the red fog. Clara stood in the doorway of the saloon. Her bonnet was askew, her face white with terror. She wasn't looking at Kincaid. She was looking at Taza. Don't do it, she begged, stepping over the shattered doors. If you kill him, they will hang you. Please, Taza, look at me. Taza froze. His fist hovered inches from Kincaid's face. He looked at the captain, whose eyes were bulging with the fear of death. Then he looked at Clara. He saw the terror in her eyes. Not terror of Kincaid, but terror for him. She was begging him to save himself. The red haze receded, leaving Taza cold and hollow. He loosened his grip. Kincaid gasped, sucking in air. You are not worth the rope. Taza growled. He threw Kincaid to the floor like a sack of garbage. The captain hit hard, coughing and retching. Taza turned his back on him. He walked toward Clara, his chest heaving, his hands shaking with the adrenaline dump. He took her arm, gently this time. We go, he said. They walked out of the saloon, past the stunned crowd, past the men groaning in the dirt. No one stopped them. The display of raw power had been too absolute. But as they retreated to the inn, Kincaid dragged himself up to the bar. He wiped the blood from his mouth, and a smile, broken and malicious, twisted his lips. He attacked me, Kincaid wheezed to the bartender, loud enough for the gathering townsfolk to hear. You all saw it. I was speaking peace, and the animal tried to kill me. He's rabid, and he's got to be put down. The retribution was swift. It did not come with guns at first, but with the law, twisted to serve the mob. An hour before sunset, the sheriff arrived at Vance's rooming house. Sheriff Miller was a weary man who preferred to look the other way, but Kincaid had forced his hand. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, refusing to look Clara in the eye. I got a complaint. Clara, Miller mumbled. Attempted murder? Assault? It was self-defense, Clara argued, standing in the doorway. Kincaid threatened us. He reached for his gun. That ain't how the boys tell it, Miller said, shifting his weight. And Kincaid is a captain. Taza is, well, he's an Apache. He is a man, Clara said fiercely. Look, Clara, Miller sighed. I can't stop this. Kincaid is raising a posse. They're drinking whiskey and talking about ropes. I can hold them off for tonight, maybe. But come morning, or sooner, they're coming here. And they're going to burn this place if he's inside. He looked up then, meeting her gaze with a sad desperation. You got a choice. Clara, you turn him out. You tell the town you're done with him. You renounce him. If he's gone, maybe the boys calm down. Maybe you keep your inn, but if you harbor him, I can't protect you. They'll burn it down with both of you in it. He put his hat back on. I'm sorry. Clara, truly. You got until moonrise to decide. He walked away. Clara closed the door and leaned against it, sliding down until she hit the floor. She buried her face in her hands. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. Give him up or lose everything. Her home, her livelihood. The only thing she had built for herself in a world that took everything away. For a moment, the old Clara, the beaten wife who learned to survive by surrendering, rose up. It would be so easy. Tell him to go. He was strong. He could survive in the mountains. She could stay, scrub the floors, apologize to the town, and live a gray, empty, safe life. Then she looked up. Taza was standing at the top of the stairs. He had heard every word. He turned and walked silently back into the room he had been using. Clara scrambled to her feet. Taza! She ran up the stairs. She pushed open the door to his room. He was packing. It didn't take long. He owned almost nothing. He was rolling his blanket, shoving his few spare rounds of ammunition into his pocket. He picked up his rifle. What are you doing? Clara demanded, her voice rising to a panic. Taza didn't look at her. He tied the leather thong around the blanket roll with a sharp jerk. I am leaving. The sheriff is right. If I am gone, the fire does not come. You can't go, Clara said. They are out there. Kincaid will track you. They have horses. You're on foot. They'll run you down in the open. I know the land, Taza said. I will lead them away from you into the deep canyons. They will not catch me. He turned to face her. His face was set in that terrible, stoic mask again. It is better this way. Clara, I was never yours. I was just a shield you borrowed to keep the wolves away. Now the shield is heavy. Put it down. He moved to brush past her. Clara felt a fury ignite in her chest. Hotter than the fear. Hotter than the shame. It was a righteous, blinding anger at his stupidity, at his nobility, at his refusal to see her. She grabbed his shirt with both hands and shoved him backward. He barely moved, but he stopped, surprised. Don't you dare, she shouted. Don't you dare decide for me. You think you're saving me by leaving me here? To what? To serve whiskey to the men who spit on me, to apologize to Kincaid, to live in this house alone for the rest of my life, listening to the wind and wishing I had been brave enough to fight. You will live, Taza said gently. That is what matters. That is not living, Clara screamed. She was crying now, the tears tracking hot paths through the dust on her face. That is just not dying. There is a difference. Taza, I know, because I did it for 5 years. She gripped his buckskin shirt, pulling him down toward her. You were not a shield, she sobbed, her voice breaking. You were never just a shield. I lied to them. Taza, I told them you were mine. But I wasn't lying to you. I wasn't lying to myself. Taza stared at her, his heart pounding a thunderous rhythm against his ribs. Clara, I meant it, she whispered, her voice fierce and trembling. I meant it when I claimed you. I want you. I love you, you stubborn, foolish giant. I love your scars. I love your silence. I love that you are the only man who ever looked at me and saw a person, not a thing to be used. She pressed her body against his, crushing the distance between them. I would rather burn, she vowed, looking up into his dark eyes. "I would rather burn this hole into the ground and stand in the ashes with you than sleep one more night in a safe bed without you. Do not leave me, Taza. Do not you dare leave me." Taza felt the walls of his resolve crumble. He looked at this woman, this fierce, broken, beautiful creature who was offering him the one thing he had been denied his entire life. A home, not a place, but a person. He dropped the rifle. It clattered to the floor. He wrapped his massive arms around her, lifting her almost off her feet, burying his face in her neck. He breathed her in. Soap, lavender, and the salt of her tears. "Clara," he groaned. "My heart, my blood." She found his mouth with hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate. It was a collision of two souls who had been starving for a lifetime. It tasted of fear and longing and a defiance that burned brighter than any fire Kincaid could set. For that moment, the town did not exist. The posse did not exist. There was only the heat of their bodies and the terrifying, wonderful truth of their bond. Crack! The sound of a gunshot shattered the world. Glass exploded in the room downstairs. A shout went up from the street, raw and ugly. "Burn them out!" Taza broke the kiss, his head snapping up. He smelled it instantly, the sharp, acrid scent of kerosene, followed by the crackle of dry wood catching flame. "They are early," Taza said, his voice dropping to a battle command. Clara gasped, looking toward the window where an orange glow was already dancing against the glass. "They set the porch on fire. The time for deciding is gone," Taza said. He grabbed his rifle and shoved it into its scabbard. He grabbed Clara's hand, his grip bruising in its intensity. "Now we survive." Smoke began to curl under the door, gray and choking. The roar of the fire outside grew louder, joined by the whoops and hollers of Kincaid's men. They were not waiting for moonrise. They were not waiting for the law. Clara looked at the door, then at Taza. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry. She squeezed his hand. "Together," she said. "Together," Taza echoed. He kicked the door open, and they ran into the hallway, where the air was already turning hot and the future was a wall of flame. The hallway was a tunnel of choking gray smoke. The heat was already bleeding through the floorboards, searing the soles of their boots. Taza did not hesitate. He moved with the terrifying momentum of a falling boulder, dragging Clara toward the back of the house. The kitchen was their only hope, but even there, the air was beginning to shimmer with the encroaching inferno. "The window!" Taza coughed, his voice rough with smoke. He didn't bother with the latch. He wrapped his arm in the heavy wool of his blanket and punched through the glass and the wooden frame in one violent motion. The night air rushed in, feeding the fire behind them, creating a roar like a living beast. "Go!" Taza commanded. He lifted Clara as if she weighed no more than a sack of dry corn. Clara scrambled through the broken frame, her skirts catching on splinters, her hands scraping against the rough siding. She tumbled out into the dirt of the alleyway, landing hard on her knees. The air here was cooler, but it smelled of kerosene and hate. Taza followed her, squeezing his massive frame through the opening just as the kitchen door gave way to a wall of orange flame. He hit the ground and immediately pulled her into the shadow of a stack of shipping crates. "My house!" Clara gasped, staring up. The flames were licking up the side of the building now, consuming the sign she had painted herself, eating the porch where she had scrubbed away the insults only yesterday. 5 years of sweat, 5 years of defiance, 5 years of surviving Silas and the town. All of it was turning into black smoke against the stars. "Look away," Taza whispered, his hand gripping her shoulder. "It is just wood. You are the life. Look away." He pulled her toward the darkness of the alley. They needed to move. Kincaid's men were shouting at the front of the inn, celebrating their destruction. But it would only be a moment before they circled back. They ran. They scrambled over a rotting fence and splashed through a muddy drainage ditch. They were heading for the stand of cottonwoods near the dry creek where Miguel had tied the extra horses he had been unable to sell. "There!" a voice shouted from the roof of the livery stable. "In the alley. I see them." A gunshot cracked the air, sharp and spiteful. Clara flinched as the bullet kicked up dirt 3 feet to her left. "Run!" Taza roared. He shifted his position. Placing his broad back between Clara and the shooter, he became a moving wall, shielding her retreat. Another shot rang out. Clara heard a wet, sickening thud, like a stone hitting a melon, and Taza stumbled mid-stride. A grunt of pain was torn from his throat, but he didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He shoved her forward, his hand heavy on her back. "Don't stop," he snarled. They burst into the clearing by the creek. The horses, spooked by the fire and the gunfire, were straining at their tethers. There were 2 of them, a roan mare and a tall, ugly gelding with a Roman nose. Taza slashed the ropes with his knife. He grabbed Clara by the waist and threw her onto the mare's bare back. "Ride," he shouted, swinging himself onto the gelding. The horse buckled slightly under his weight but found its footing. "Taza, you're hit!" Clara screamed, seeing a dark stain spreading rapidly across the white sleeve of his shirt. "Ride!" Taza yelled again, slapping the rump of her mare. They thundered out of the creek bed just as the posse reached the edge of the alley. More shots whined past them, angry bees in the dark. But the night was their ally now. They galloped into the open scrubland, leaving the burning town of Granite Wells behind them. The glow of the fire painted the horizon red, a bloody sunrise in the middle of the night, marking the death of the life Clara Vance had known. They rode until the horses were blown and lathered, putting 10 miles of rough country between them and the fire. The land swallowed them. This was Taza's world now, a landscape of shadows, dry washes, and silence. They slowed to a walk as they entered a labyrinth of sandstone spires. The moon was high and cold, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. Taza led them into a narrow fissure in the rock, a place where the horses could be hidden from the skyline. He slid off the gelding and nearly fell. "Taza!" Clara slid from the mare and ran to him. He was leaning against the stone wall, his breathing ragged. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the cold reality of the wound. The bullet had furrowed a deep groove across his upper left arm, tearing muscle and grazing the bone. Blood had soaked his entire sleeve and was dripping from his fingers. "It is not deep," Taza lied, his voice tight. "Sit down," Clara ordered. Her hands were shaking, but her voice had the steel of the innkeeper who had thrown out drunkards. "Let me see it." He sank to the ground. Clara used his knife to cut away the ruined sleeve. The wound was ugly, raw and angry in the moonlight. She tore a strip from her petticoat, the white cotton stark against the dark rock. "This will hurt," she whispered. "Do it." Taza grunted. She wrapped the makeshift bandage tight, stemming the flow of blood. Taza didn't make a sound, but his muscles knotted under her fingers, hard as ironwood. As she worked, Clara found herself touching his skin not just as a nurse, but with a desperate, tactile need to confirm he was real, that he was alive. Her fingers brushed the old scars that mapped his chest, burn marks, knife slashes, the puckered craters of old bullet wounds. "So many," she whispered, tying the knot. "Maps of bad roads." Taza rasped. He looked at her. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair wild, her dress torn. She looked like a refugee from hell, but in his eyes, she had never been more beautiful. She was alive. She was with him. "You are shaking," he said. "I'm afraid," Clara admitted, sitting back on her heels. She looked at her hands. "I lost everything tonight. Taza, my home, my clothes, my mother's Bible. It's all gone." "You have your life," Taza said. "You have your breath. The rest is just things to carry." "It was my independence," Clara said, her voice cracking. "No." Taza reached out with his good hand, covering hers. His palm was warm, calloused, encompassing. "Your independence is in here." He tapped her chest. "Fire cannot burn that. Kincaid cannot shoot that." They rested for an hour, huddled together for warmth, before moving on. They could not stop. Kincaid was a tracker. He would wait for dawn to read the sign, but he would be coming. For the next 3 days, they existed in a blur of survival. They moved deeper into the broken country. heading toward the high mountains where the air was thin and the water was scarce. Taza taught her how to vanish. "Do not ride on the ridges," he instructed her as they navigated a field of cholla cactus. "You are a silhouette against the sky. Ride in the low places. The shadows are your friends." He showed her how to wrap the horse's hooves in strips of blanket to muffle their steps on the stone. He taught her to drink from a muddy seep by filtering the water through her teeth, taking small sips so she wouldn't retch. Clara learned fast. She had to. The woman who had fussed over clean linens and polished silver was gone, peeled away by the desert sun. In her place was a creature of dust and determination. She watched Taza constantly. She saw how he scanned the horizon, his eyes never resting. She saw how he favored his wounded arm, though he never complained. She noticed the way he looked at her. It happened when she was scraping cactus spines from her skirt, or when she managed to light a small, smokeless fire in a cave. He would look at her with a profound, quiet wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was still there. And she noticed her own heart every time he helped her down from the horse, his hand lingering on her waist. She felt a jolt that had nothing to do with fear. The trauma of the fire had stripped away the social veneer. There was no innkeeper and guest here. There was only a man and a woman, keeping each other alive. On the fourth night, they reached the high country. The heat of the desert floor gave way to a biting, bone-deep cold. The wind howled through the pines, carrying the scent of snow. They found shelter in a shallow depression beneath an overhang of granite. It was out of the wind, but the temperature was dropping fast. They had no fire tonight. They were too close to the open passes where a flame could be seen for 20 miles. They had only 2 thin blankets and the heavy buffalo robe Taza carried behind his saddle. "We must share the heat," Taza said, spreading the robe on the ground. He didn't look at her. He was trying to be practical, to be the scout who knew how to prevent freezing. Clara looked at the makeshift bed. Then she looked at him. "Yes," she said. They lay down together. Taza lay on his back, stiff and careful, trying to give her space. Clara lay beside him, pulling the blankets over them. The cold was aggressive. It bit at their noses and toes, instinctively. Clara moved closer. She pressed her side against his. She felt the heat radiating from him like a furnace. "Clara," Taza warned, his voice a low rumble in the dark. "Shut up." "Taza?" she whispered. She turned on her side and draped her arm across his chest, just as she had done that night in the inn. But this time, there was no mob at the door. There was no lie to tell. She traced the line of the bandage on his arm. Then her fingers moved to his chest, finding the jagged ridge of an old knife wound. "Tell me about this one," she said softly. "A Comanchero blade," Taza said, his breathing hitching. 10 years ago. "And this one?" She touched a burn scar near his collarbone. "A branding iron, when I was a boy, captured by ranchers." Clara leaned up on her elbow. She looked down at his face in the dim starlight. "They hurt you so much. Everyone has hurt you. Pain is proof that you are still fighting," Taza said. "The dead do not feel pain. I don't want to just fight anymore," Clara whispered. "I want to feel something else." She lowered her head and kissed the scar on his collarbone. Taza let out a sharp breath. His hand came up, tangling in her hair. "Clara, I am not a gentle man. I am too big, too rough. You are the gentlest man I have ever known," she said fiercely. "Silas was small. Taza, he was a small, handsome man, and he broke my ribs. You could crush me with one hand, but you have carried me." She kissed his throat. She felt his pulse hammering against her lips. "I claimed you," she whispered against his skin. "I told them you were mine. I want to make it true." Taza's resistance shattered. The wall he had built around his heart, the belief that he was unlovable, a monster, a tool of war. It crumbled under the weight of her tenderness. He turned to her. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "You are mine," he groaned. "You are my blood, my breath." He kissed her. It was not the desperate kiss of the burning inn. It was slow. It was devout. It was a man drinking water after a lifetime in the desert. He was terrified of hurting her. He moved with agonizing slowness, letting her set the pace. But Clara was not fragile. She met him with a hunger that matched his own. She pulled him closer, needing the weight of him, needing the reality of him to drive out the ghosts of her past. When he touched the scars on her back, the remnants of Silas's belt, his fingers were trembling. He kissed the marks, murmuring vows in Apache that she didn't understand but felt in her marrow. He promised the moon and the stars that no hand would ever be raised against her in anger again. In the darkness of that canyon, amidst the smell of pine needles and horse sweat, they unmade the world and built a new one. There was no shame here. There was no savage and no whore. There was only the friction of skin, the salt of sweat, and the profound, earth-shaking relief of being fully, completely known. They made love with a fierce urgency, a desperate affirmation that they were alive, that they were worthy, that they belonged to each other. When Clara cried out, it was not in fear, but in release, a sound that the wind carried away into the vast, empty night. Later, they lay tangled together beneath the buffalo robe. The cold was still there, waiting outside their cocoon, but they didn't feel it. Taza's arm was numb where her head rested, but he would cut it off before he moved it. "Where do we go?" Clara asked sleepily, her hand resting on his chest, rising and falling with his breath. "North," Taza said, staring up at the stone overhang. "There is a valley, deep in the Mongolian rim. My grandfather hunted elk there. It is far from the trails. The white men do not go there. The gold is too hard to find." "We could build a cabin," Clara murmured, her imagination taking flight. "Not a big one, just one room, but with a good stove and a window facing east, for the morning light." "I will cut the logs," Taza said. "I will build it strong. No wind will shake it. And a garden," Clara added. "I saved some seeds in my pocket. Beans, squash. Maybe they survived the fire." "We will plant them," Taza promised. "And if we have a son, he will learn to track the elk, and he will learn to read the books." "And if we have a daughter?" Clara asked, smiling against his skin. "Then she will have her mother's fire," Taza said, "and the world will be afraid of her." It was a beautiful dream. It hung in the air like a soap bubble, shimmering and fragile. But morning brought the needles of reality. Taza woke before dawn. He felt it in the ground before he heard it. A vibration, a rhythm. He slipped out from under the robe, tucking it around Clara. He climbed the ridge silently, ignoring the stiffness in his wounded arm. He peered over the edge of the stone, looking back the way they had come. They were there, 5 miles back. Moving across a low saddle of land was a line of dust. Riders. They were moving fast, pushing their horses. Kincaid had guessed their route. He knew Taza would head for the high water. Taza watched them for a long moment. His face hardened. The dream of the cabin, the garden, the quiet life. It receded. They could not outrun horses forever. Their mounts were tired. His arm was weakening him. If they stayed in the open, Kincaid would run them down within 2 days. He slid back down to the camp. Clara was awake, sitting up, holding the blanket to her chest. She saw his face. "They are coming," she said flatly. "Yes," Taza said. "They are close. We have to ride." "We cannot run fast enough," Taza said. He began to saddle the gelding with jerky, angry movements. "They have fresh horses. We do not. If we run, we die in the open." "Then what do we do?" Clara asked. Standing up, she didn't look afraid anymore. She looked ready. Taza stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the direction of the sunrise. "We go to the people," he said. Clara froze. "Your people? The ones who rejected you?" "There is a band," Taza said, "led by Cochise's cousin. They are camped near the Blue River. It is a day's ride, hard riding." "Will they help us?" Taza tightened the cinch until the leather creaked. "They will not want to. They hate the white eyes. And they despise me for the blue coat I wore." But they are the only sanctuary we have. If we reach the camp, Kincaid cannot attack without starting a war. And if they turn us away, then we die at their feet instead of Kincaid's, Taza said. It is a better death. The ride to the Blue River was a blur of agony. They pushed the horses until the animals were stumbling. The sun beat down on them, relentless and cruel. Clara's lips cracked. Taza's wound began to bleed again, soaking the bandage, but he refused to stop. They reached the camp at twilight. It was tucked into a deep fold of the land, invisible until you were right on top of it. Wickiups made of bare grass and canvas were scattered among the trees. Smoke from cooking fires drifted in the air. As they rode in, the camp dogs exploded into barking. Children stopped their playing and ran to their mothers. Men emerged from the shelters, rifles in hand. The silence that greeted them was hostile and heavy. Taza rode with his head high, though he was dizzy with pain. He stopped his horse in the center of the camp. He did not dismount. That would be a sign of weakness. Clara pulled her mare up beside him. She felt the eyes of the Apache women on her. They looked at her torn dress, her sunburned face, her white skin. There was no pity in their gaze, only a hard, diamond-sharp contempt. They saw a trespasser. They saw a bringer of soldiers. An older man walked forward. He wore a red headband and carried a repeating rifle. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his eyes like black flint. This was Mangus, the leader. He looked at Taza. He looked at the blue army trousers Taza still wore. He spat on the ground. "Why do you come here? Blue coat?" Mangus asked in Apache. The words were harsh, guttural. "You have no fire here. You are dead to us," Taza answered in the tongue of his fathers, though the words felt strange in his mouth after so long. "I am chased. The white soldiers hunt me." "Good," Mangus said. "Let them catch you. Why bring them to our door?" He looked at Clara, his lip curled. "And you bring a white woman, a trophy, or a pet?" "She is neither," Taza said. "She brings death." An old woman shouted from the circle. "Look at her! She smells of the towns! The soldiers will follow her scent!" "Send them away," a warrior yelled. "Or kill them before they bring the sickness." The circle of men tightened. Rifles were raised. The threat was palpable. They were seconds away from being shot by the very people Taza had hoped would save them. Clara's horse danced nervously. She reached out and took Taza's hand. She didn't know the words they were speaking, but she knew the tone. She squeezed his fingers, hard. Taza looked at her. He saw the trust in her eyes. She was the only person in the world who saw him. He took a deep breath. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. He staggered slightly but caught himself. He reached up and helped Clara down. He walked to the council fire, dragging Clara with him. He stood before Mangus. He towered over the elder, but he bowed his head in a show of respect. He did not feel. "Listen to me," Taza shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion. He switched to a mix of Apache and Spanish so everyone could understand, his voice trembling but resolute. "I serve the army. Yes, I wear the scars of my shame. I have no right to ask for your fire, but this woman—" He pulled Clara forward. She stood tall, terrified but unbowed. "This woman saved my life," Taza declared. "When the white men came to kill me, she stood in front of the gun. She burned her home to stand with me. She has walked the desert and bled the same blood." The camp was silent. They were listening now. "You call her enemy," Taza said, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "But she has more honor than the men who cast me out. She is my heart. She is my chosen partner." He looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of the warriors who had once been his brothers. "I do not ask you to fight for me, but I ask sanctuary for her. If you will not give it, if you say we must go—" He squeezed Clara's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Then I will go. We will ride out to meet the soldiers, and I will die shielding her, as an Apache should die protecting his own. But know this, Mangus, if we die out there because you turned us away, then it is you who has forgotten what it means to be people." He stood there, swaying with fatigue, holding the white woman's hand in the glow of the fire. waiting for the judgment that would determine if they lived to see the sunrise. The fire in the center of the Apache camp burned low, casting long, wavering shadows against the hide walls of the wickiups. The air was thick with the smell of juniper smoke and the tension of a verdict hanging by a thread. Taza stood like a stone pillar, his hand still gripping Clara's, while the council of elders debated the fate of the two intruders who had stumbled out of the desert. Mangas, the leader with the face like a dried riverbed, sat cross-legged, his rifle across his knees. Beside him, the other men spoke in rapid, guttural bursts of the Apache tongue. Taza translated for Clara in a low whisper, his voice vibrating in the quiet space between them. "The one with the scar says we are poison," Taza murmured, his eyes never leaving the fire. "He says the white soldiers track us like wolves track a bleeding deer. He says if we stay, the camp will burn." Clara tightened her grip on his fingers. "And the other one? The younger man?" "He says times change." Taza translated. "He says the white eyes are everywhere, like locusts. He says maybe a bridge between worlds is better than a wall. He says my strength could protect the camp." Clara watched the faces in the firelight. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. She saw the fear in the eyes of the mothers clutching their children. She saw the weary pride in the old men. She realized with a sudden, crushing clarity that she and Taza were not just refugees. They were a question that this band of people did not know how to answer. From the shadows beyond the firelight, a woman stepped forward. She was young, with heavy silver earrings and a blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her face was beautiful, but hard, her eyes dark with a mixture of resentment and old familiarity. She carried a toddler on her hip, the child's round face peering out with curiosity. Taza stiffened. "Nalin," he breathed. It was the woman he had once expected to marry, the woman who had looked at his army coat and turned her back. Nalin walked up to Taza, ignoring Clara completely. She looked at the giant man, her eyes tracing the new bandage on his arm and the dust on his face. "You bring the storm with you." "Taza," she said in Apache, her voice flat. "Always the storm. You left to serve the soldiers, and now you return with one of their women. Do you hate your own blood so much?" Taza met her gaze. "I do not hate my blood. Nalin, I hate that my blood did not think I was enough." Nalin flinched. She shifted the child on her hip. "I chose safety," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Chaudhry is a good man. He does not walk in two worlds. He stays where he belongs. When I looked at you, Taza, I saw only war. I saw a man who would never be at peace. I have a child now. I could not risk him for a ghost." She finally looked at Clara. She looked at the white woman's torn dress, her sunburned skin, and the fierce way she stood beside the giant, refusing to hide behind him. "She does not look safe," Nalin observed. "No," Taza said softly. "She is not safe. She is brave. She chose the fire rather than let me stand alone." Nalin looked back at Taza, and for a moment, the hardness in her face cracked. A shadow of the girl she had been passed through her eyes. A regret, perhaps, or just a realization that the man she had rejected had found something she had not thought possible. "Then go with her," Nalin said. "If the council lets you live, go. Do not stay here and remind me of what I was too afraid to choose." She turned and walked back into the darkness, the child bouncing on her hip. Taza watched her go, and Clara felt a tension leave his body, a final exhale of a breath he had been holding for years. The shame of his rejection was gone, replaced by the certainty of the woman standing beside him. The council did not decide that night. They argued until the moon was high, then dispersed, leaving Taza and Clara to sleep on the edge of the camp, guarded by two silent warriors. The next day passed in a grueling limbo. The posse had not yet appeared, but the scouts reported dust on the horizon. The threat was creeping closer. Clara could not sit still. She could not be the helpless burden Nalin had accused her of being. She saw the women of the camp working, scraping hides, grinding corn, carrying water from the creek. She stood up, smoothed her ruined skirts, and walked toward the stream. She found a heavy clay jug sitting near a fire and picked it up. The women stopped their work and watched her. Their eyes were cold, suspicious. Clara walked to the creek, filled the heavy jug, and hauled it back. She set it down near an old woman who was trying to wash a pile of clothes with arthritic hands. The woman looked up, startled. Her face was a map of deep wrinkles, her eyes clouded with cataracts. Clara did not speak. She simply rolled up her sleeves and knelt in the mud. She took the clothes and began to scrub, using the rhythm she had perfected in 5 years of running the inn. The old woman watched her. Then, slowly, she reached out and touched Clara's arm. She said something in Apache, her voice cracking. Taza, who had been watching from the edge of the trees, stepped closer. "She asks if you have lost a child," he translated quietly. "She says you scrub like a woman trying to wash away grief." Clara froze. She looked at the old woman, seeing the pain etched into her features, the universal language of loss. "Tell her yes," Clara whispered. "Tell her I lost a baby, and a husband who was not a husband." Taza translated. The old woman nodded slowly. She reached into her sash and pulled out a small piece of dried meat, handing it to Clara. It was a peace offering, a recognition that pain knew no color. By evening, the mood in the camp had shifted. It was not acceptance, not yet, but the hostility had dulled. Clara sat by Taza near their small fire, exhaustion pulling at her bones. "They are debating again," Taza said, looking toward the elders. "Mangas wants to send us away at dawn. He says Kincaid will burn the camp if we are found here." "If they send us away," Clara said, staring into the flames. "We will go. We will find that valley you talked about, the one in the Mongolian rim." "It is a hard life," Taza warned. "Cold winters, no town, no people." "I have had enough of people," Clara said. She reached out and took his hand, her palm rough against his. "I only need one person." Taza looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You claimed me in a lie," he said softly, remembering the inn. "I claimed you to save our lives," Clara corrected him. "But now I claim you because I cannot imagine a world where you are not the first thing I see in the morning. Even if they reject us, even if the whole world spits on us, you are my country. Taza, you are where I live." Taza lifted her hand to his lips. He kissed her knuckles, a gesture of devotion so profound it made her throat tighten. "Then we stand," he said, "together." Dawn came not with the sun, but with a crack of thunder that had no clouds. A gunshot echoed off the canyon walls. Then another, and another. The peace of the morning was shattered by the screaming of horses and the high, thin whine of bullets tearing through the air. "Attack!" Taza roared. Leaping to his feet, the camp exploded into chaos. Women screamed, grabbing their children and running for the cover of the rocks. Warriors scrambled from their wickiups, rifles in hand, trying to form a defensive line. Through the drifting smoke and morning mist, riders appeared. They wore long dusters and wide hats. At their head rode Captain Kincaid, his face a mask of grim, vengeful satisfaction. He had found them. He had brought the war to the doorstep of the people who had cast Taza out, proving that the giant was a curse upon them. "Burn it!" Kincaid shouted, waving a torch. "Burn every rat hole! Flush them out!" A rider threw a torch onto the dry roof of a wickiup. It went up in a sheet of orange flame. "Go!" Taza shouted to Clara, pushing her toward the back of the camp. "Take the children! Get to the rocks!" "I won't leave you!" Clara screamed over the noise of the gunfire. "You must!" Taza yelled. "Lead them! They do not know where to run!" He pointed to a group of terrified children and the old woman, Elu, who were frozen in panic. Clara understood. He was giving her a duty. He was trusting her with the future of his people. She grabbed Elu's arm. "Come on!" she shouted. She scooped up a crying toddler. "To the rocks! Follow me!" She led the group of non-combatants toward a narrow defile at the rear of the canyon, a rocky chute that led up to higher ground. Bullets kicked up dirt around their feet. Clara did not look back. She focused on the path, on the heavy child in her arms, on the old woman stumbling beside her, behind her. Taza turned to face the enemy. He did not have a rifle. He had left it by the fire. He had only his knife and his hands. He saw a rider charging toward a group of women, a saber raised. Taza ran. He moved with a speed that defied physics for a man of his size. He collided with the horse, shoulder-checking the animal with the force of a battering ram. The horse staggered and fell, throwing the rider. Taza was on him before he hit the ground. He snatched the man's pistol, fired once to scatter a second attacker, and then waded into the smoke. He was a demon of war. He fought not for the army, not for the tribe that shunned him, but for the woman climbing the rocks behind him, the Apache warriors, seeing the exile fight with such ferocity, rallied. Mangas shouted commands, his rifle cracking as he picked off riders from the cover of a wagon. The surprise attack was faltering. Kincaid's men had expected a slaughter, not a hornet's nest. "Fall back," one of the posse shouted. "There's too many of them." "No!" Kincaid screamed, his eyes scanning the chaos. "I want the girl. I want the giant." He saw movement near the rocks. He saw the white dress of the woman leading the children. Kincaid spurred his horse. He ignored the gunfire. He rode straight for the defile, cutting through the smoke. Clara had just pushed the last child up the ledge when she heard the hoofbeats. She turned. Kincaid was there, looming over her, his horse rearing. "End of the line, Clara," he snarled. He leaned down and grabbed her by the hair. Clara screamed, dropping to her knees. He dragged her backward, away from the safety of the rocks. "I told you I'd take you back," Kincaid shouted, raising his pistol. "You're going to tell the whole territory what a mistake you made, and then I'm going to hang your pet from the nearest tree." Clara clawed at his hand, her scalp burning. She looked around for a weapon. Her hand closed over a sharp, jagged rock. "Let her go." The roar shook the canyon walls. Taza emerged from the smoke. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, blood masking one eye. He saw Kincaid. He saw Clara in his grip. Kincaid laughed. He swung his pistol toward Taza. "There you are. I was hoping you'd watch." He cocked the hammer. Clara did not wait. She swung the rock with every ounce of desperation she possessed. She smashed it into Kincaid's side, right where his ribs met his hip. Kincaid grunted in pain, his aim wavering. The gun fired, the bullet tearing through the air inches from Taza's head. In that split second of distraction, Taza closed the distance. He grabbed Kincaid's boot and heaved upward. Kincaid flew out of the saddle, landing hard in the dirt. Clara scrambled away, gasping. Kincaid rolled, coming up with the pistol leveled at her. "Bitch!" he screamed. Taza stepped in front of the gun. He didn't dodge. He walked straight into the line of fire. Kincaid pulled the trigger. Click. Empty. Taza didn't stop. He kicked the gun out of Kincaid's hand. He reached down, grabbed the captain by the lapels of his duster, and hauled him to his feet. Kincaid drew a Bowie knife from his belt, slashing wildly. The blade cut a line across Taza's chest, but Taza didn't even flinch. He caught Kincaid's wrist in midair. He squeezed. There was a sickening crunch of bone. Kincaid screamed, dropping the knife. Taza spun him around and slammed him against a boulder. He pinned him there, his forearm across Kincaid's throat. Taza's other hand raised, balled into a fist that could crush a skull. "Do it!" Kincaid choked out, blood bubbling on his lips. "Kill me, savage! Prove me right!" Taza held the fist there. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving like a bellows. The rage was a red tide, demanding release. He wanted to end it. He wanted to smash the life out of this man who had hunted him, tormented him, and tried to destroy the only thing he loved. "Taza." Clara's voice was quiet. She was standing beside him. Blood was trickling from a graze on her arm, where a stray bullet had nicked her, but she was standing tall. "Don't," she said. "He wants you to be the monster. Don't give it to him." Taza looked at Kincaid's eyes. He saw the hate there, but also the fear, and he saw the trap. If he killed him in cold blood, he justified every lie Kincaid had ever told. Taza slowly lowered his fist. "I am not the monster," Taza growled. "You are." He released Kincaid, letting him slide down the rock. Kincaid gasped, clutching his throat, looking up in disbelief. "Get up," Taza ordered. Kincaid scrambled to his feet, looking for a weapon, looking for a way out. "Go," Taza said, pointing to the desert. "Without your horse, without your gun, without your boots. You can't," Kincaid stammered. "The land will judge you." Taza said, "If you are a man of honor, the spirits will guide you. If you are poison, the desert will drink you." The Apache warriors had gathered around. They had watched the fight. They watched now as Taza stripped the enemy of his power, not by killing him, but by dismissing him. Mungus stepped forward. He looked at Kincaid, then at Taza. He nodded once. "Go," Mungus said in English. Kincaid looked at the circle of silent, hostile faces. He looked at Clara, who stood beside the giant with her hand on his arm. He saw his defeat was absolute. He turned and began to walk, barefoot and broken, into the harsh, unforgiving expanse of the alkali flats. The sun was high now. The posse, seeing their leader broken and cast out, had fled, their will to fight evaporating with the morning mist. The camp was quiet. The fires were being put out. The wounded were being tended. Mungus approached Taza and Clara. He stopped in front of them. He looked at the blood on Taza's chest and the bandage on Clara's arm. "You fought well," Mungus said. "You fought for the children. I fought for my family," Taza said, his hand tightening on Clara's. Mungus looked at Clara. He did not smile, but the contempt was gone from his eyes. "The woman has a warrior's heart. She is welcome at the fire." He paused, looking toward the distant mountains. "But the blue coats will come again. They will come looking for Kincaid. This camp must move." "We go deep into the Sierra Madre." He looked Taza in the eye. "You cannot come with us. Taza, the memory of the scout coat is still too fresh for some. It would bring poison to the council." Clara felt Taza tense. It was the rejection again. "But," Mungus continued, "there is a valley to the north, near the Sweetwater. It is old Apache land. We do not go there anymore. The spirits are quiet there. You can build your fire there. We will tell the soldiers we saw you go south to Mexico. We will give you horses and blankets." It was a compromise. It was not full acceptance, but it was not exile. It was a gift of peace. Taza nodded slowly. "It is enough." 6 months later, the winter had been hard. The snow had piled deep in the passes, and the wind had tried to tear the roof off the world. But the cabin held. It sat in a sheltered hollow near a stream that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. It was small, built of sturdy ponderosa logs chinked with mud and moss. A plume of blue smoke rose steadily from the stone chimney, a signal of life in the vast, empty wilderness. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth. The room smelled of pine resin, dried sage, and the rich aroma of venison stew. Taza sat by the fire, whittling a piece of ironwood. He looked different. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet calm. He was still the giant, still a mountain of a man, but the tension that had defined his life had dissolved. Clara stood by the window, looking out at the twilight. The snow was melting. Patches of green were pushing through the earth. "The creek is rising," she said. "We can plant the beans next week. And the corn," Taza said. "I cleared the rocks from the lower field today." He put down his knife and walked to her. He stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. He rested his chin on the top of her head. She leaned back into him, fitting perfectly against his massive frame. "Do you miss it?" she asked softly. "The town? The people?" "I miss nothing," Taza said. "I have the world right here." He turned her around. His hand came up to cup her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "You are thinking of that night," he said. "Which night?" Clara teased gently. "The night you lied." Taza smiled, a rare, brilliant expression that transformed his face. "When you told the men I was yours." "I told you," Clara said, reaching up to touch the scars on his chest. "I didn't realize how much of you I was taking. You take up a lot of room in a bed." Taza, and you take up all the room in my heart, he answered. He lifted her up, carrying her toward the bed in the corner. It was a bed made of heavy logs, covered in thick furs and a quilt Clara had stitched from the remnants of their old lives. They lay down together as the candles burned low. Outside, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that drifted across the valley. But inside, there was no loneliness. They lay tangled together, limbs heavy with the good fatigue of hard work. Taza pulled the quilt over them. He held her close, listening to her breathe, listening to the silence of the valley that belonged only to them. They were outcasts. They were rejects. The world beyond the mountains still had no place for a giant Apache and a scarred white woman. But here, in this cabin built with their own hands, they were kings and queens. Clara rested her head on his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. She closed her eyes. "We made it," she whispered. "Yes," Taza whispered back, kissing her forehead. "We are home." And as the firelight danced on the walls, casting shadows that looked like future generations, children who would run free in the valley, laughter that would echo off the stones, they slept, hand in hand, fully claimed and fully loved, in a world they had built from the ashes of the old. Thank you so much for listening to this story of Taza and Clara. I hope their journey through the rugged landscapes of the human heart resonated with you. It is a reminder that sometimes the places where we least belong are the places where we find our true selves. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you watching from the deserts of Arizona, the cities of Europe, or somewhere else entirely? Please leave a comment below and tell me your location. And if you enjoyed this tale of survival and love, please make sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel. Share your thoughts on the story in English in the comments section. Did Taza make the right choice with Kincaid? I read every comment and cherish your insights. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright.